Picture this, October 26th, 1440. The city of Nantes is buzzing with an energy that feels almost electric. Crowds have gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of curiosity, horror, and something darker, anticipation. The air carries the scent of burning wood from the executioner's fire, mingling with the damp autumn mist rolling in from the Loire River. At the center of it all stands a man who, just 11 years earlier, had been celebrated as one of France's greatest heroes. Now, shackled and broken, Gilles de Rais waits for his final moments. His once proud shoulders are hunched, his face gaunt from months of imprisonment. The fine silks and ermine that once adorned his noble frame have been replaced by rough prison garb. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. This isn't just any condemned man. This is someone who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Joan of Arc herself, charging into battle with the battle cry, "For God and France," echoing from his lips. The same hands that now shake in chains once wielded a sword in defense of his homeland. The same mind that would confess to unspeakable crimes had once strategized brilliant military victories. How does a war hero become a monster? That's the question that haunted medieval Europe and continues to puzzle us today. Think about it for a moment. Imagine being 25 years old, wealthy beyond measure, respected by kings, and fighting alongside the most famous woman in French history. You're living in what feels like a golden age, at least for you. Victory follows victory. Your name is spoken with reverence in royal courts, and the future seems limitless. Then, in one devastating moment, everything changes. Joan of Arc, the woman who seemed touched by God himself, is captured by the English. Worse still, she's betrayed by her own people, sold for money like a common criminal. On May 30th, 1431, you watch the smoke rise from Rouen, knowing that the person who gave your life meaning is burning at the stake. What do you do with that kind of loss? How do you process that level of betrayal? Not just personal betrayal, but a betrayal of everything you believed was right and holy in the world. For Gilles de Rais, the answer was to retreat. He abandoned the battlefield that had made him famous and withdrew to his massive castle at Tiffauges in Brittany. But here's where the story gets really interesting and really dark. Instead of finding peace in retirement, Gilles seemed to be running from something much deeper than grief. The man who had once lived for duty and honor suddenly became obsessed with pleasure and excess. He threw himself into a life of luxury that would make modern billionaires blush. We're talking about theatrical performances that cost more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, religious ceremonies, so elaborate they bordered on the absurd, and construction projects that seemed designed more to impress God than any human being. His family watched in horror as their fortune, one of the largest in France, began to disappear. Picture concerned relatives pleading with him to stop, to think about the future, to remember his responsibilities. But Gilles wasn't listening anymore. It was as if Joan's death had broken something fundamental in his soul, and he was trying to fill that void with anything that might make him feel alive again. Here's where the story takes an even darker turn. When conventional pleasures failed to satisfy him, when even the most elaborate entertainments left him feeling empty, Gilles began to explore territories that medieval society considered forbidden. He started surrounding himself with alchemists and supposed sorcerers, men who promised they could turn base metals into gold or contact the spirit world. But it wasn't just about money anymore. According to the testimonies that would later surface during his trial, Gilles became convinced that supernatural forces could restore not just his wealth, but his sense of purpose. He allegedly began attempting to summon demons, particularly one called Barron, believing that such entities could grant him power beyond human understanding. The truly chilling part: these rituals reportedly required a very specific kind of sacrifice. Now, before we go any further, we need to remember that we're dealing with medieval court records, confessions extracted under threat of torture, and a justice system that was far from perfect. But what emerged during Gilles de Rais's trial was a pattern of missing children, dozens of them, from the villages surrounding his properties. The man who had once protected France from foreign invaders was now accused of being the predator lurking in his own countryside. Parents who had once spoken his name with pride now whispered it in fear. Children who might have grown up hearing stories of his battlefield heroics instead became part of a much darker tale. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the dramatic fall from grace, It's the very human question at its heart. We all face moments when life doesn't go according to plan, when the things we believe in let us down, when loss threatens to destroy everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the world. Most of us find ways to cope, to rebuild, to find new meaning. But what happens when someone with unlimited power and resources chooses a different path? What happens when grief and disappointment curdle into something much more dangerous? That's the story we're about to explore together. Not just the tale of one man's crimes, but a deeper look at how quickly honor can turn to horror, how the same passion that creates heroes can also create monsters, and how the medieval world tried to make sense of evil that seemed to come from nowhere. This is the story of Gilles de Rais, warrior, nobleman, patron of the arts, and according to the courts that condemned him, one of history's most prolific killers. It's a story that would echo through the centuries, inspiring dark fairy tales and cautionary legends, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who once walked among us as heroes. Let's go back to the beginning, to a time when Gilles de Rais's name meant something entirely different. Picture 1404, a world where your birth determined everything about your future, where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, and where true wealth meant owning vast stretches of land that stretched beyond the horizon. Gilles was born into this world at the very top of the social pyramid. His family's castle at Champtocé-sur-Loire wasn't just a home. It was a statement of power that could be seen for miles. When you owned land the way the de Rais family owned land, you weren't just wealthy. You were practically a king in your own territory. But here's what's fascinating about medieval nobility. Wealth came with expectations. You couldn't just sit around counting your gold coins. If you were born into the warrior class, you were expected to fight, and not just fight occasionally, but to make warfare your profession, your art, your entire reason for existing. Gilles took to this life like he was born for it, which in many ways he was. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already earned a reputation as someone you definitely wanted on your side in a battle. We're talking about an era when combat was personal and brutal. No guns, no explosives, just men in heavy armor swinging swords and axes at each other until one side gave up or died. The Breton Succession War was Gilles' first real taste of large-scale warfare, and it was ugly even by medieval standards. This wasn't some noble crusade or glorious quest. It was a grinding, years-long conflict over who would control the wealthy duchy of Brittany. Think of it as a medieval version of a corporate takeover, except instead of lawyers and accountants, the weapons were armies and siege engines. Picture young Gilles, probably in his early 20s, learning the harsh realities of command. He's not just swinging a sword anymore. He's responsible for hundreds of men, making decisions that will determine whether they go home to their families or end up buried in foreign soil. It's the kind of responsibility that either breaks you or transforms you into something harder, more decisive, more willing to do whatever it takes to win. And Gilles didn't just survive this brutal education, he excelled at it. His fellow nobles began to notice him, to seek his advice, to want him fighting alongside them rather than against them. By his mid-20s, he had become exactly what medieval society valued most, a proven warrior with the resources to back up his reputation. But then, something happened that changed not just Gilles' life, but the entire course of French history. A peasant girl from a village no one had ever heard of claimed she was hearing voices from God, telling her to drive the English out of France and crown the rightful king. Most people would have laughed at Joan of Arc. In fact, most people did laugh at her, at least initially. Medieval society didn't exactly encourage teenage girls to give military advice to kings. But Joan had something that cut through all the skepticism and social barriers, an absolute unshakable conviction that she was doing God's work. When Gilles first encountered Joan, probably sometime in early 1429, he was already an experienced military commander. He'd seen plenty of people who claimed divine inspiration, plenty of self-proclaimed prophets and visionaries who turned out to be either delusional or fraudulent. But Joan was different. Imagine meeting someone who radiated such certainty, such purpose, that it made you question everything you thought you knew about how the world worked. Joan didn't just talk about faith, she embodied it in a way that was impossible to ignore. When she said God had chosen her to save France, she said it with the kind of conviction that makes you want to believe, even if your rational mind is telling you it's impossible. For Gilles, this meeting wasn't just a military alliance, it was a spiritual awakening. Here was someone who seemed to have found the very thing that most people spend their entire lives searching for: absolute certainty about their purpose in life. And more than that, she was inviting him to be part of something larger than personal glory or family honor. The siege of Orléans in 1429 was where their partnership really proved itself. This wasn't just another battle. It was a turning point in what had seemed like an endless war. The English had been systematically conquering French territory for decades, and Orléans was one of the last major strongholds standing between them and total victory. Picture the scene. A city under siege for months, its people starving, its defenders exhausted, and everyone expecting it to fall any day. Then this teenage girl shows up with a small army, claiming God has sent her to save them. Most military commanders would have dismissed it as a suicide mission, but Gilles was there when Joan's seemingly impossible strategy actually worked. He watched her inspire soldiers who had been ready to surrender. He saw her turn a desperate defensive action into an aggressive counterattack that drove the English back in confusion. He was part of the victory that seemed to prove, beyond any doubt, that Joan really was chosen by God. Think about what that must have felt like for someone like Gilles. He'd spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of warfare, learning every tactical principle, studying every great military leader from history. Then this untrained peasant girl shows up and demonstrates a kind of leadership that makes all his hard-won expertise seem almost irrelevant. But instead of being threatened by Joan's success, Gilles became one of her most devoted followers. Some historians suggest there was a romantic element to their relationship, but the evidence points to something deeper and more complex than simple attraction. Joan represented everything Gilles had been searching for without knowing it, a cause worth fighting for that went beyond personal ambition or family loyalty. Over the months that followed Orléans, Gilles and Joan fought side by side in battle after battle. Each victory seemed to confirm that they were part of something miraculous, something that would be remembered long after they were gone. For Gilles, this wasn't just the peak of his military career, it was the period when his life had the clearest meaning and purpose it would ever have. But here's the tragic irony that makes this story so compelling. The very success that proved Joan's divine mission also made her dangerous to the people who were supposed to be on her side. Medieval politics were complicated, and a peasant girl who claimed to speak for God was threatening to a lot of powerful people who had their own ideas about how France should be governed. When Joan was captured by the English in May of 1430, Gilles faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could have tried to rescue her, could have raised an army to demand her release, could have made her freedom the focus of his remaining years. Instead, he did what most of the French nobility did. He accepted her capture as the unfortunate cost of war and moved on with his life. But acceptance and moving on turned out to be two very different things. When Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431, something fundamental broke inside Gilles de Rais. The woman who had given his life meaning, who had made him believe in something larger than himself, was gone. And worse than gone. She had been betrayed by the very people she had fought to save. How do you recover from watching your deepest beliefs proven wrong in the most brutal way possible? How do you go back to ordinary life after experiencing what felt like a direct connection to the divine? These are the questions that would haunt Gilles for the rest of his life, and the answers he found would transform him from a hero into something far more sinister. After Joan's death, Gilles de Rais made a decision that seemed reasonable on the surface, but would prove to be the first step toward his ultimate downfall. He retired from military life and retreated to his ancestral lands in Brittany, specifically to his massive castle at Tiforges. On paper, this makes perfect sense. He was wealthy beyond measure, he'd served his country with distinction, and he'd earned the right to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But retirement for someone like Gilles wasn't the same as retirement for ordinary people. When you're used to leading armies, making life and death decisions, and living with the constant rush of battle, peaceful castle life can feel like a kind of death in itself. And when you're dealing with the kind of spiritual crisis that Joan's death had triggered, having too much time to think can be dangerous. The castle at Tiforges was the perfect place for someone to lose themselves in excess. Picture a fortress that was less like a military installation and more like a medieval version of a luxury resort. We're talking about dozens of rooms, each one designed to showcase the owner's wealth and taste. The Great Hall alone could accommodate hundreds of guests, with tapestries from the finest weavers in Europe and furniture that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. But here's where Gilles' story takes its first really troubling turn. Instead of finding peace in this luxury, he seemed to be running from something. The man who had once been focused and disciplined became obsessed with sensation, with experiences that were more and more elaborate, more and more expensive, and more divorced from reality. Let's talk about the theatrical productions first, because they give us a glimpse into just how far removed from normal life Gilles had become. He didn't just enjoy watching plays, he became a patron of theatre on a scale that was unprecedented for his time. He commissioned original works, hired entire troupes of actors, and staged productions that were so elaborate they bordered on the absurd. Picture this. A single performance might involve dozens of actors in costumes that cost more than a knight's armor, sets that took months to build, and special effects that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible in the 15th century. These weren't community theatre productions, they were spectacles designed to transport audiences into completely different worlds. But here's what makes this particularly telling. Many of these productions had religious themes, specifically stories about saints and martyrs. It's as if Gilles was trying to recreate the sense of divine purpose he'd felt with Joan, but through artificial means. He was essentially trying to manufacture spiritual experiences through increasingly elaborate entertainment. The religious projects were even more extreme. Gilles didn't just attend church services, he founded his own religious institutions. The Chapel of the Holy Innocents, which he built and funded entirely out of his own pocket, was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture and religious art. But it was also a massive financial drain that served no practical purpose other than to satisfy his need for grandiose gestures. Think about the mindset behind this kind of spending. Gilles wasn't just buying things he wanted, he was trying to fill a void that seemed to grow larger the more he fed it. Each new project had to be bigger, more impressive, more elaborate than the last. It was as if he was trying to prove something to God, or to Joan's memory, or maybe just to himself. His family watched this transformation with growing alarm. These weren't just concerned relatives worried about wasteful spending. They were people who understood that the family's wealth, vast as it was, wasn't infinite. The de Rais fortune had been built up over generations, carefully managed and invested, designed to support not just Gilles, but his descendants for centuries to come. Picture the awkward family meetings, where cousins and uncles tried to convince Gilles to slow down, to think about the future, to remember his responsibilities. But Gilles wasn't interested in being responsible anymore. He'd been responsible when he fought with Joan, and look how that had ended. He'd been responsible when he served his king faithfully, and what had he gotten for it? The woman who had given his life meaning was dead, and the cause they'd fought for together seemed hollow and meaningless. So instead of listening to his family's concerns, Gilles doubled down on his spending. He began selling off pieces of the family's land holdings to fund his increasingly expensive lifestyle. Now, in medieval times, selling ancestral land wasn't just a financial decision, it was almost a form of sacrilege. Land was what made you noble, what connected you to your ancestors, what you were supposed to pass on to your children. But Gilles was no longer thinking about his children or his ancestors. He was living entirely in the present, chasing experiences that might help him forget the pain of Joan's loss and the emptiness that had filled his life since her death. The most troubling aspect of this period wasn't just the extravagant spending, it was the kind of people Gilles began surrounding himself with. A responsible nobleman would have advisors who helped him manage his estates, plan for the future, and maintain his reputation. Instead, Gilles' court became filled with entertainers, flatterers, and increasingly people who claimed to possess supernatural knowledge. This is where the story gets really dark, because Gilles' interest in the occult wasn't just intellectual curiosity. He was a man desperately searching for something that conventional religion and conventional pleasures couldn't provide. He'd experienced what he believed was a direct connection to the divine through Joan, and now he was willing to explore any avenue that might restore that connection, no matter how dangerous or forbidden. The alchemists and supposed sorcerers who began appearing at Tifoges weren't just harmless eccentrics. These were people who claimed they could transform base metals into gold, communicate with spirits, and unlock the secrets of life and death. For someone in Gilles' mental state, grieving, guilty, and desperate for meaning, these promises must have seemed like exactly what he needed. But here's the thing about people who prey on desperation. They always ask for more. First, it was just money for equipment and materials. Then it was more elaborate ceremonies, more expensive ingredients, more time and attention devoted to their supposed craft. And eventually, according to the testimony that would later surface at his trial, they began asking for things that went far beyond gold or material goods. The servants at Tiffauges began to notice changes in their master that went beyond mere eccentricity. He became secretive, holding meetings behind closed doors that could last for hours. He began taking trips to remote locations on his property, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Most disturbing of all, he began showing interest in children from the surrounding villages in ways that made people uncomfortable. Now, we have to be careful here, because we're dealing with medieval court records and testimony that was given under threat of torture. But what emerged from multiple independent sources was a pattern of behavior that suggested Gilles had moved far beyond harmless occult dabbling into something much more sinister. The tragedy of this period in Gilles' life is that it was completely preventable. He had everything he needed to live a meaningful, productive life: wealth, social position, military reputation, and the respect of his peers. But instead of dealing with his grief and spiritual crisis in healthy ways, he chose to run from them through increasingly destructive behavior. By the late 1430s, the man who had once been celebrated as one of France's greatest heroes had become a source of fear and suspicion in his own lands. The gold that had once flowed like wine was running out. His family's patience was exhausted, and the people who lived near his properties were beginning to whisper stories that, if true, would transform him from a fallen hero into something far worse, a monster who preyed on the innocent. This is the crossroads where Gilles de Rais' story becomes not just a tale of personal tragedy, but a warning about what happens when grief and desperation are allowed to fester without check or consequence. The choices he made during this period of his life would soon lead him down a path from which there would be no return, setting the stage for crimes that would shock medieval Europe and echo through history as a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk in even the most celebrated human hearts. By 1438, Gilles de Rais was facing a crisis that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The man who had once commanded the resources of one of France's wealthiest families was running out of money, not just getting low on funds, actually running out. The lavish theatrical productions, the religious projects, the constant stream of hangers-on and flatterers had drained even his vast fortune to dangerous levels. But here's where Gilles' story takes a turn that reveals just how far he'd fallen from the disciplined warrior he'd once been. Instead of accepting reality, cutting back on expenses, and rebuilding his wealth through conventional means, he became convinced that supernatural forces could solve all his problems. It's as if he'd decided that the normal rules of economics and finance didn't apply to him anymore. The occult practitioners who had been whispering in his ear for months suddenly found themselves with a much more receptive audience. These weren't just harmless fortune tellers or herb sellers. Some of them were genuinely dangerous individuals who understood exactly how to manipulate someone in Gilles' desperate state of mind. The most significant of these figures was a man named Francesco Prelati, an Italian who claimed to be a scholar and alchemist. Prelati was exactly the kind of person who thrived in the chaotic world of medieval occultism, intelligent enough to sound convincing, charismatic enough to inspire confidence, and unscrupulous enough to take advantage of wealthy, desperate clients. Picture this meeting between Gilles and Prelati. Here's a man who once made life and death decisions on battlefields, who commanded armies and earned the respect of kings, now hanging on every word of a con artist who promised impossible things. Prelati didn't just offer to help Gilles make gold through alchemy. He claimed he could summon demons who would grant unlimited wealth and power. The demon's name, according to the trial records that would later surface, was Barron. Now, we need to understand what this meant in the context of medieval beliefs about supernatural forces. This wasn't just superstition. Educated people in the 15th century genuinely believed that demons existed and could be contacted through specific rituals. The church taught that such contact was not only possible, but extremely dangerous, both to the soul and to society as a whole. For Gilles, the appeal wasn't just financial. He'd lost his connection to the divine when Joan died, and now he was being offered a chance to connect with supernatural forces again. even if those forces came from the opposite direction. It was as if he'd decided that if God wouldn't answer his prayers, maybe the devil would be more accommodating. The rituals that Prelati described weren't simple ceremonies. According to the testimony that would later emerge, they required specific locations, particular times of day, elaborate preparations, and most disturbing of all, very specific types of sacrifices. We're entering territory here that's difficult to discuss, but it's essential to understanding how Gilles's spiritual crisis led to something unthinkably horrible. Medieval demonology, such as it was, held that different supernatural entities required different kinds of offerings. Some supposedly wanted gold or precious objects, others demanded blood from animals. But the most powerful demons, according to these beliefs, required human sacrifice, and not just any human sacrifice, but offerings that were considered particularly pure and innocent. This is where Gilles' story crosses the line, from tragic to truly horrifying. The children who began disappearing from villages around his properties weren't random victims of common criminals or wild animals. According to the evidence that would later be presented at his trial, they were deliberately targeted as offerings for these supposed demonic rituals. Now we have to be extremely careful about how we approach this part of the story. The medieval justice system was far from perfect, and confessions were often extracted through torture or the threat of torture. Some modern historians have suggested that the charges against Gilles were exaggerated or even fabricated by political enemies who wanted to seize his remaining wealth. But what's undeniable is that children did disappear, that parents in the surrounding area lived in genuine fear, and that something was happening at Gilles' properties that went far beyond eccentric behavior or unconventional religious practices. The pattern that emerged from witness testimony was particularly chilling. Children, usually boys between the ages of 6 and 16, would be approached by Gilles' servants with offers of employment, food, or shelter. These weren't random kidnappings. They were carefully planned recruitments that targeted families who were poor enough to be grateful for any opportunity to improve their children's prospects. Picture the heartbreak of parents who thought they were giving their children a chance for a better life, only to have those children vanish without a trace. In small medieval communities, everyone knew everyone else's business, so when children started disappearing in significant numbers, the whispers and suspicions began almost immediately. What makes this particularly tragic is that Gilles' reputation as a war hero initially protected him from suspicion. People found it hard to believe that someone who had fought so bravely for France, who had stood beside Joan of Arc herself, could be responsible for harming innocent children. His social position and past service created a kind of shield that allowed the disappearances to continue longer than they might have otherwise. But as the numbers grew, and some estimates from the trial proceedings suggest we're talking about dozens of victims, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. The disappearances were concentrated around Gilles' properties. They increased when he was in residence and decreased when he was away. And most damning of all, some of his own servants began to come forward with stories that painted a picture of systematic horror. The details that emerged during his trial were so shocking that many people at the time refused to believe them. We're talking about rituals that supposedly involved not just murder, but torture and mutilation designed to maximize the victim's suffering. The theory, according to the occult practitioners who had influenced Gilles, was that the greater the innocence and pain of the sacrifice, the more powerful the supernatural forces that could be summoned. What's perhaps most disturbing about this period in Gilles' life is how completely he seems to have abandoned any moral constraints that had once guided his behavior. The man who had once fought to protect his country was now preying on its most vulnerable citizens. The person who had been inspired by Joan's divine mission was now convinced that he was serving darker supernatural masters. His remaining advisors and family members watched this transformation with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Some tried to intervene, to convince him that what he was doing was not only morally wrong but incredibly dangerous from a practical standpoint. Medieval authorities didn't take kindly to behavior that threatened social order, especially when it involved harm to children. But Gilles was beyond reason at this point. The combination of financial desperation, spiritual crisis, and what appears to have been genuine mental instability had created a person who was capable of justifying almost anything if it served his perceived needs. He'd convinced himself that these horrific acts were actually a form of spiritual practice, a way of accessing power that conventional religion had denied him. The tragedy is that none of this had to happen. Even at this late stage, Gilles could have chosen differently. He could have acknowledged his financial problems, sought help from his family, accepted a reduced lifestyle, and found legitimate ways to rebuild his fortune and his sense of purpose. Instead, he chose to believe that supernatural shortcuts could solve problems that required natural solutions. By 1439, the situation around Gilles' properties had become so notorious that local authorities could no longer ignore it. Parents were keeping their children inside after dark. Travelers were avoiding roads that passed near his castles. The man who had once been celebrated as a protector had become the thing that people needed protection from. The end was coming, though Gilles himself seemed oblivious to the danger he was in. His faith in the occult practices that had consumed his life remained unshaken, even as evidence mounted that they had brought him nothing but ruin. He'd made his bargain with forces he believed could grant him everything he wanted, but like all such bargains in stories and in life, the price would prove to be far higher than he'd ever imagined. The spark that finally ignited the confrontation between Gilles de Rais and medieval justice came from an unexpected source. Not the disappearing children, but a dispute over a piece of property. In September of 1440, Gilles got into a heated argument with a local cleric over the control of a church benefice. The argument escalated quickly, and in a moment of rage that revealed just how far his judgment had deteriorated, Gilles actually had the priest kidnapped. This was the mistake that would bring everything crashing down around him. Kidnapping a member of the clergy wasn't just a crime, it was a direct challenge to the authority of the church, and in medieval Europe, that was something no one could do with impunity, no matter how noble their birth or how illustrious their past service. Jean de Malestroit, the Bishop of Nantes, saw this incident as the opening he'd been waiting for. The church had been receiving whispered reports about strange happenings at Gilles' properties for months, but they'd needed a legitimate reason to move against such a powerful nobleman. The kidnapping gave them that reason, and once they started investigating one crime, it didn't take long for them to uncover evidence of much worse offenses. Picture the scene when the bishop's men arrived at the castle of Machecoul to arrest Gilles. This wasn't a simple police action. It was more like a military operation, with armed guards, church officials, and representatives of the secular authorities all working together. The man they were arresting had once commanded armies, and no one was taking any chances on his reaction. What's fascinating about Gilles' arrest is how calmly he seemed to accept it. According to the records, he didn't resist, didn't try to use his remaining influence to avoid capture, didn't even seem particularly surprised. It was as if some part of him had been expecting this moment, maybe even welcoming it as an end to the nightmare his life had become. The trial that followed was unprecedented in medieval legal history, partly because of the nature of the crimes alleged, but mostly because of who was being accused. Gilles wasn't just any nobleman, he was a Marshal of France, a hero of the 100 Years' War, someone who had fought beside Joan of Arc herself. The idea that such a person could be guilty of the things he was accused of challenged everything medieval society believed about honor, nobility, and divine justice. The proceedings took place in Nantes, and they drew crowds from across Brittany and beyond. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle that promised to reveal secrets that people had been whispering about for years. The courtroom was packed with nobles, clergy, merchants, and common people, all straining to hear every word of testimony that might explain how a celebrated hero had become an accused monster. The prosecution's case was built on testimony from Gilles' own servants, and this is where the story becomes both more credible and more horrifying. These weren't enemies or rivals making accusations for political gain. They were people who had worked closely with Gilles, who had seen what happened behind the closed doors of his castles, and who were now willing to risk their own lives to tell the truth. The most damaging witness was Etienne Corillot, also known as Poitou, who had served as Gilles' personal attendant for years. His testimony painted a picture of systematic horror that shocked even the experienced judges who had heard many terrible cases during their careers. According to Poitou, the disappearances weren't random or accidental. They were part of a deliberate program of recruitment, abuse, and murder that had been going on for years. But here's where the story gets complicated in ways that still puzzle historians today. The medieval justice system relied heavily on confession, and confessions were often obtained through torture or the threat of torture. When Gilles finally confessed to the crimes he was accused of, Was he telling the truth, or was he simply saying whatever he thought his captors wanted to hear? The confession itself was extraordinary, both for its detail and for the apparent remorse that Gilles displayed. He didn't just admit to killing children, he described specific incidents, named individual victims, and expressed what seemed to be genuine horror at his own actions. He wept openly in court, begged forgiveness from the families of his victims, and appeared to be a man who was finally confronting the full magnitude of what he had done. According to the court records, Gilles confessed to killing more than 100 children over a period of several years. The methods he described were so brutal that some of the clerks taking down his testimony had difficulty writing them out. We're talking about acts that went far beyond simple murder, torture, mutilation, and abuse that seemed designed to maximize suffering rather than simply end life. But even as we recount these confessions, we have to remember the context in which they were given. Medieval trials weren't like modern legal proceedings. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, and no protection against self-incrimination. The entire system was designed to extract confessions, and torture was considered a legitimate tool for discovering the truth. This raises uncomfortable questions about Gilles' guilt that historians are still debating today. Some scholars argue that the evidence against him was overwhelming: multiple independent witnesses, physical evidence from his properties, and a pattern of behavior that was consistent with the charges. Others suggest that he was the victim of a conspiracy by church and secular authorities who wanted to seize his remaining wealth and eliminate a troublesome nobleman. The political context certainly supports the conspiracy theory to some extent. Gilles still owned valuable properties despite his financial troubles, and his execution would allow those properties to be redistributed to people who were more politically reliable. Medieval justice was often indistinguishable from medieval politics, and it wouldn't have been the first time that criminal charges were used to eliminate someone for essentially political reasons. But there's also the testimony of the families whose children had disappeared. These weren't political actors or ambitious nobles. They were ordinary people who had lost their children and who genuinely believed that Gilles was responsible. Their pain and anger seemed too real, too specific, to be part of an elaborate political conspiracy. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence is how Gilles himself reacted to the charges. If he had truly been innocent, if the whole thing had been a frame-up, you'd expect him to maintain his innocence, even under torture. Instead, he not only confessed but seemed almost relieved to finally be able to tell someone about the horrors he'd been living with. The trial lasted for several weeks, and as it progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just about determining Gilles' guilt or innocence. It was about trying to understand how such things could happen, how someone who had once embodied the highest ideals of medieval society could have fallen so far. The judges weren't just pronouncing sentence on a criminal, they were trying to make sense of evil itself. The final verdict was never really in doubt. The evidence was too overwhelming, the confessions too detailed, and the public outrage too intense for any other outcome. But the trial had accomplished something beyond simple justice. It had forced medieval society to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters could emerge from the most unlikely places, that honor and heroism were no guarantee against the darkest impulses of human nature. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was sentenced to death by hanging, followed by burning. As he awaited execution, he seemed to have found a kind of peace that had eluded him for years. He spent his final days in prayer, apparently preparing for a death that he now saw as the only possible end to a life that had gone terribly wrong. Picture this: it's October 26, 1440, and the crowds have gathered in the town square of Nantes. The man they've come to see die was once their hero, Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, the warrior who fought alongside Joan of Arc herself. But now, as the executioner's rope tightens around his neck, he's become something else entirely, a monster whose name will echo through the centuries. Forgive me, God, forgive me. These were among his final words, spoken with such genuine anguish that even some of his accusers felt a chill run down their spines. Was this the desperate plea of a truly repentant soul, or the calculated performance of a master manipulator trying to save his skin one last time? As the flames consumed his body, the standard practice for heretics in those days, nobody could have predicted that Gilles de Rais would achieve a peculiar kind of immortality. His story wouldn't just fade into dusty court records. Instead, it would transform, mutate, and eventually emerge as one of the most enduring fairy tales in Western culture, the legend of Bluebeard. Think about it for a moment. How does a real person become a fairy tale character? It doesn't happen overnight. The transformation of Gilles de Rais into Bluebeard took decades, maybe even centuries, as his story passed from chronicler to chronicler, from storyteller to storyteller, each adding their own dark embellishments. The original Bluebeard tale, as most of us know it today, tells of a wealthy nobleman with a distinctive blue-tinged beard who marries a series of young women only to murder them when their curiosity gets the better of them. They discover his secret chamber filled with the bodies of his previous wives, and that discovery seals their fate. It's a story about forbidden knowledge, about the deadly consequences of female curiosity, about the monsters that can hide behind wealth and respectability. But here's where it gets fascinating. The fairy tale Bluebeard kills his wives, while the historical Gilles de Rais was accused of murdering children. So how did one become the other? The answer lies in the medieval mind's understanding of evil itself. You see, in the 1500s, when these tales were really taking shape in popular culture, people didn't make the same distinctions we do today between different types of crimes. Evil was evil, and a man who could kill innocent children could just as easily kill innocent women. The storytellers took the core of Gilles' evil, his betrayal of trust, his abuse of power, his hidden chamber of horrors, and reshaped it into a form that resonated with their audience's fears about marriage and male authority. There's something almost poetic about this transformation. Gilles de Rais, who had once been the epitome of chivalric virtue, fighting alongside the Maid of Orleans, became the ultimate anti-knight in popular imagination. Where chivalry demanded the protection of the innocent, Bluebeard preyed upon them. Where knights were supposed to be paragons of honor, Bluebeard embodied deception and betrayal. But the real genius of the Bluebeard legend lies in what it reveals about the storytellers themselves. Think about the wives in the tale. They're not passive victims, they're curious, brave, sometimes clever enough to escape. The story becomes a warning, yes, but also a celebration of female intelligence and courage. It's as if the collective unconscious took this historical monster and used him to explore deeper truths about power, curiosity, and survival. The influence didn't stop with fairy tales either. Centuries later, writers like Charles Perrault would polish the story into the version we know today. Then came countless adaptations, variations, and reimaginings. The tale of Bluebeard has appeared in operas, novels, films, and even modern psychological thrillers. Each generation finds something new in this old story, some fresh horror or insight to explore. What's particularly haunting is how the legend preserves something essential about the historical Gilles de Rais that might otherwise have been lost. Not the specific details of his crimes, but the deeper truth about what he represented, the corruption of privilege, the monster hiding behind the mask of respectability, the way power can transform a hero into a villain. Modern historians continue to debate whether Gilles was truly guilty of all the charges brought against him. Some argue he was framed by political enemies eager to seize his lands. Others point to the consistency of witness testimony and his own confessions as evidence of guilt. But in a strange way, the fairy tale has made these historical debates almost irrelevant. The legend of Bluebeard has become more real, more influential than the man who inspired it. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Gilles de Rais's legacy. In life, he may have destroyed dozens of lives, traumatized countless families, and terrorized an entire region. But in death, through the strange alchemy of storytelling, he achieved something far more lasting. He became a permanent part of our collective imagination, a shadow that haunts our dreams and our fairy tales. Every time a child hears the story of Bluebeard, every time someone warns about the dangers of curiosity or the monsters that hide behind charming facades, the ghost of Gilles de Rais lives on. His name may be forgotten by most, but his essence, that peculiar mixture of charm and evil, power and corruption, continues to terrify and fascinate us. In the end, perhaps that's the most fitting punishment for a man who sought immortality through dark magic and murder. He got his immortality all right, but not as the glorious hero he once was. Instead, he lives on as humanity's nightmare, a cautionary tale told in whispers, a reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who were once our greatest heroes. Glory fades, as they say, But infamy? That lasts forever, shape-shifting through the centuries, adapting to each generation's fears, but never truly dying. In that way, Gilles de Rais achieved something no amount of gold or sorcery could have given him, a legacy that will endure as long as humans tell stories to frighten and warn each other in the dark.